"Go ahead," she told the deputy. "Arrest him. He just shut off the water to hundreds of innocent families." The old steel valve groaned beneath my hand as I turned it the last quarter turn. A deep metallic vibration traveled through the pipe, followed by silence so complete I could hear the wind brushing across the dry prairie grass behind my cattle barn. The smell of damp earth and fresh-cut cedar drifted through the morning air, mixing with diesel from a county cruiser racing up my gravel driveway. Blue lights flashed across my weathered equipment shed before I even took my hand off the valve wheel. Deputy Collins climbed out first, adjusting his hat, while another patrol vehicle rolled in behind him. Then came Diane Fairchild, stepping out of her white Lexus in pressed golf clothes that somehow looked more expensive than my entire ranch truck. Her smile stretched wider with every step she took toward me. She looked like someone arriving to collect a trophy instead of watching the biggest mistake of her life unfold. "That's him," she shouted before either deputy spoke a single word. "He deliberately shut off the neighborhood's water supply. He's endangering children, livestock, elderly residents, everyone." I looked down at the rusty valve beside my boots. My boots were covered in red Texas clay from replacing a leaking fitting before sunrise. My hands still smelled like pipe dope, iron, and well water. I hadn't touched anything that belonged to Diane. I had only closed the main valve sitting on land my family had owned since 1968. That valve fed one place: my ranch. At least, it was supposed to. Deputy Collins looked from Diane to me with the tired expression of a man who had already responded to too many neighborhood disputes. "Sir," he said calmly, "can you explain what's going on?" I nodded once. "Absolutely. I turned off my own water." Diane laughed loud enough to startle a pair of doves from the oak tree behind the windmill. "See," she snapped. He admitted it. The deputies exchanged another glance. Something about their silence made Diane impatient. She kept talking, filling every empty second with accusations. According to her, my ranch had somehow become responsible for supplying water to the entire Silver Pines Estates subdivision. According to her, I had intentionally sabotaged community infrastructure. According to her, I was selfish, reckless, and probably violating half a dozen county regulations she clearly didn't understand. I never interrupted. My father used to tell me that people drunk on borrowed authority always reveal more than anyone could ever prove against them. So I let her keep talking while the Texas sun climbed higher above the pasture. What Diane didn't know was that 11 months earlier, every pressure gauge on my ranch had started telling me the same strange story. My cattle troughs filled slower. My irrigation lines lost pressure every afternoon. My electric pump ran longer than it had in 20 years. Water doesn't simply disappear underground. It goes somewhere. And after months of quiet observation, receipts, survey maps, camera footage, and one discovery buried beneath a decorative HOA flower bed, I finally knew exactly where every missing gallon had been going. I hadn't shut off their water that morning. I had only closed the illegal pipeline they never imagined I would find. My name is Caleb Whitaker, and if there is one thing you should know about me, it is that I have never believed in winning an argument by raising my voice. My father spent 43 years running Whitaker Ranch, and he always said that the loudest man usually had the weakest paperwork. Growing up here in the Texas Hill Country, I learned to repair fences before I learned algebra, to read water gauges before I drove a pickup, and to respect every gallon that came out of our well, because every dry summer reminded us that water was not just another utility. It was survival. Our ranch covered 63 acres of rolling pasture dotted with live oaks, limestone ridges, and a spring-fed well drilled by my grandfather in 1968. The old steel storage tank stood on the highest point of the property like a silent guardian. Every morning before sunrise, I made the same routine. I checked the pump pressure, listened to the electric motor hum for a few seconds, watched the storage level, and filled. The cattle troughs before the summer heat settled over the fields. Those quiet mornings always smelled like fresh hay, damp cedar, and rich black coffee from the thermos riding beside me in the truck. After my father passed away 5 years earlier, the ranch became more than inherited land. It became a promise. I had left a comfortable engineering job in Austin because I refused to watch developers slowly erase 3 generations of my family history. Friends told me I was crazy for trading an air-conditioned office for broken fences, stubborn cattle, and endless repairs. But every evening, when the sunset painted the pasture gold, I knew I had made the right choice. Things stayed peaceful until Silver Pines Estates appeared beyond the eastern property line. What had once been open grazing land transformed into expensive houses with perfect sidewalks, decorative stone entrances, and lawns so green they almost looked artificial. At first, I welcomed the new neighbors. Growth happens. People need homes. I even attended one community barbecue during their first summer and shook plenty of hands. That was when I met Diane Fairchild. She introduced herself before anyone else could, smiling with polished confidence while explaining she served as president of the Homeowners Association. Within 5 minutes, she had already informed me that my windmill looked outdated, my entrance sign needed fresh paint, and my cattle occasionally wandered too close to the shared fence. I remember laughing politely because I assumed she was joking. She was not. Over the following months, letters started arriving in my mailbox despite the fact that my ranch had never belonged to her association. Suggestions became demands. Friendly conversations became lectures about community standards. Every visit ended with the same expensive perfume lingering in the air long after her white Lexus disappeared down the county road. Still, none of that truly bothered me. People like Diane always believed confidence could replace ownership. What concerned me was something entirely different. Around that same time, my water pump began running longer every single afternoon, and numbers never lie, even when people do. The first clue arrived so quietly that most people would have ignored it. Every afternoon at almost exactly 3 o'clock, the pressure gauge beside my pump house dipped by nearly 12 pounds before climbing back again after sunset. Pumps were out. Pipes leak. That is what most ranchers would assume. I did not. Engineers develop an unhealthy habit of trusting numbers more than opinions, and every number on my ranch insisted something underground had changed. I replaced the pressure switch first. No difference. Then I inspected nearly 2 miles of buried supply line feeding my barns, water troughs, and irrigation valves. I spent weekends walking every foot of that property beneath a blazing Texas sun with a shovel over one shoulder and a locator wand in my hand. The smell of hot limestone dust clung to my clothes every evening. My boots carried home enough red clay to fill a flower pot. Yet I never found a broken fitting or a wet patch of soil where water should not have been. Meanwhile, Silver Pines looked greener every single week. Their entrance landscaping suddenly featured fountains that had never existed before. Decorative ponds sparkled beside walking trails. Sprinklers hissed long before sunrise and continued well into the afternoon, even during county conservation advisories. It did not make sense. That subdivision relied on a municipal supply that had already announced seasonal restrictions because of lower reservoir levels. Somehow their grass stayed emerald while neighboring properties turned pale brown. Then Diane started visiting more often. She arrived one afternoon carrying a clipboard and wearing the same confident smile that always seemed one sentence away from becoming a lecture. She complimented my fences before suggesting that good neighbors should share resources during difficult seasons. She never actually asked for water. Instead, she spoke in vague phrases about community cooperation, regional responsibility, and everyone doing their part. When I politely explained that my well existed to support livestock and ranch operations, her smile stiffened for only a second before returning. She thanked me for my time and drove away. Without another word. 2 days later, I received a certified letter claiming that runoff from my property somehow affected neighborhood landscaping. The accusation was absurd, but it revealed something more important. Diane had become unusually interested in my water. I filed the letter away without responding. My father kept every receipt, permit, and survey dating back decades inside an old oak filing cabinet that still smelled faintly of machine oil and yellowed paper. He always said land tells its own story if you save enough documents to listen. One evening, I opened those drawers searching for maintenance records and found original well permits, pump installation diagrams, easement maps, and handwritten notes describing every improvement my grandfather had made. I spread them across the kitchen table beside a fresh cup of coffee while rain tapped softly against the windows. Looking at those faded blueprints, one detail caught my attention immediately. A service corridor ran along the eastern fence line where an abandoned utility easement had once existed. According to every survey in front of me, nothing should have been connected there anymore. Yet the unexplained pressure drop always began from that exact direction, and for the first time, my suspicion became something much stronger than a feeling. The next Saturday morning, I walked the entire eastern fence line before sunrise with the original survey folded inside a plastic sleeve tucked beneath my arm. The air carried the sharp scent of wet cedar after a light overnight shower, and every step across the pasture produced that familiar crunch of damp limestone beneath my boots. My grandfather always believed property lines deserved as much attention as cattle fences because both had a way of keeping trouble where it belonged. The eastern boundary stretched nearly half a mile beside Silver Pines Estates, separated by nothing more than an old barbed wire fence and a strip of native grass that county records still identified as private ranch property. At first, everything looked ordinary. Fence posts stood exactly where they had for decades. Wildflowers covered the shallow ditch. Even the old utility markers from the abandoned easement remained weathered and leaning at the same angles I remembered as a teenager. Then I noticed something that did not belong. Fresh tire tracks curved through the grass before disappearing behind a cluster of decorative shrubs planted on the subdivision side. The soil there looked darker than the surrounding ground, almost as if someone had recently disturbed it. I knelt and pressed my hand against the earth. It felt softer than it should have after only a light rain. The faint smell of new plastic drifted upward every time I brushed loose dirt aside. Somebody had buried something recently. Before I could examine it further, the quiet morning was interrupted by the gentle electric hum of a golf cart approaching from inside the subdivision. Diane stepped out wearing sunglasses and spotless white sneakers that somehow never seemed to collect dust. She smiled the same polished smile I had seen at every neighborhood meeting. "Beautiful morning for a walk," she said. I returned the greeting and folded the survey without letting her see the pages. Her eyes lingered on the fence, then the ground near my boots, before settling back on me. "I hope you are not planning any construction along this boundary," she said casually. "Our homeowners have invested a great deal in the landscaping over here." I looked toward the expensive flower beds lining the entrance road. Bright green hedges, decorative stone edging, and flowering plants stretched farther than I remembered. They certainly had not looked that healthy during last summer's drought. "No construction," I answered, "just checking my property." For the briefest moment, her smile froze. It lasted only a heartbeat before she nodded politely and climbed back into the golf cart. As she drove away, I noticed she glanced into her rearview mirror twice before disappearing around the curve. Most people would have forgotten that conversation before lunch. I could not. Diane had not asked about my fences, my cattle, or even the weather. She had asked whether I planned to dig. That single question echoed in my head the rest of the day while I studied the survey again inside my workshop. The faded blueprint showed the abandoned utility corridor crossing exactly where those fresh tire tracks ended. If someone wanted to install an underground line without attracting attention, that forgotten easement would be the perfect place to hide it. I still had no proof that anything illegal existed beneath my pasture, but for the first time I stopped looking for a leak. I started looking for a connection. I decided not to dig. Not yet. Digging without evidence would only give Diane another opportunity to paint me as the unreasonable ranch owner standing in the way of community progress. Instead, I did what engineers are trained to do when something refuses to make sense. I started collecting data. Every morning before sunrise, I wrote down the well pressure, pump cycle time, storage tank level, and electrical consumption. Every evening, I repeated the process at exactly the same hour. Within 2 weeks, a pattern emerged so precise it could have been programmed. Every weekday, water demand surged shortly after 6 in the morning, settled around midday, then climbed again between 5 and 8 in the evening. Weekends looked completely different, with heavy use beginning before sunrise as automatic irrigation systems came alive across the subdivision. The numbers matched residential water consumption almost perfectly. My cattle certainly were not taking scheduled showers twice a day. The pump itself became another witness. It had always operated for about 15 minutes every hour during the hottest months. Now it routinely ran nearly 35 minutes. The electric bill increased almost 40% compared to the previous summer despite having fewer cattle after I downsized the herd. The smell of warm motor windings greeted me every afternoon when I opened the pump house, and the constant mechanical hum that had once faded into the background now sounded like a warning that refused to stay quiet. Then another letter arrived from the Homeowners Association. This one informed me that several residents had complained about my refusal to cooperate with regional sustainability efforts. It encouraged me to attend the next board meeting to discuss shared infrastructure. Solutions. Shared infrastructure. Those two words caught my attention immediately because no legal document connected my private well to their neighborhood. I drove into town the following morning and stopped by the county records office. Mrs. Eleanor Briggs had worked behind the same wooden counter for nearly 30 years and knew more about local property history than anyone else in the building. After listening patiently, she disappeared into the archive room and returned with several oversized map books and utility filings. We spent almost 2 hours comparing subdivision plats, easement amendments, and infrastructure permits. Every approved water line serving Silver Pines connected to the municipal system on the opposite side of the development. Nothing on record crossed onto Whitaker Ranch. Mrs. Briggs adjusted her reading glasses and tapped the final approved utility map with one finger. "If water is coming from your land," she said quietly, "it certainly is not because this office ever approved it." I thanked her and carefully photographed every page she showed me. Driving home along the county road, I passed the entrance fountain at Silver Pines. Crystal clear water spilled over polished limestone while bright flower beds surrounded the sign welcoming visitors to luxury country living. The fountain had not been running the previous year during drought restrictions. Now it flowed without interruption beneath a cloudless Texas sky. I pulled onto the shoulder for just a moment and watched the water glisten in the afternoon sunlight. Something about that steady stream felt strangely familiar. The timing matched my pressure logs almost exactly. That was when I realized I was no longer chasing a suspicion. I was assembling pieces of a puzzle, and somewhere beneath the quiet grass between my ranch and their perfectly landscaped entrance, one missing piece was waiting to be uncovered. The breakthrough arrived on a quiet Tuesday evening when the entire ranch should have been nearly motionless. The cattle had already gathered beneath the oak trees. The windmill turned lazily against a fading orange sky, and the only sound should have been crickets beginning their nightly chorus. Instead, my pump kicked on with its familiar electric hum at exactly 6:14 in the evening. I checked my watch because I had been expecting it. 3 minutes later, I climbed the ladder beside the storage tank and watched the water level fall even though every valve on the ranch remained closed. No livestock were drinking. No irrigation lines were running. Nothing on my property was using a single gallon. Yet the pump continued working as though someone had opened a fire hydrant. That was all the confirmation I needed. The water was leaving my ranch, just not through anything I owned. The following morning I drove into a neighboring county and rented a professional pipe locator that utility contractors use before excavation projects. It was not cheap, but compared to months of unexplained electric bills, it felt like a worthwhile investment. I spent the afternoon following the buried steel sections of my original water system exactly as my grandfather had documented decades earlier. The locator chirped steadily through my headphones until I reached the abandoned easement along the eastern fence. Then something unexpected happened. The signal split into 2 separate directions. One path continued toward my livestock facilities exactly where it belonged. The second curved beneath the old utility corridor and headed straight toward the entrance landscaping of Silver Pines Estates. I stopped walking and repeated the scan 3 more times. Every result showed the same impossible route. I pulled the faded survey from my truck and compared landmarks one by one. The measurements matched within inches. Somebody had tied into my main supply somewhere beyond the fence line without a single permit on record. Even then, I resisted jumping to conclusions. Equipment can be wrong. Maps can contain errors. People deserve facts, not assumptions. So I called a licensed surveyor named Howard Ellis, a man my father trusted for nearly 20 years. Howard arrived 2 days later with modern mapping equipment that looked more like something from a space program than a ranch. We spent nearly 6 hours walking property lines beneath relentless Texas sunshine, while his instruments quietly recorded elevations, coordinates, and underground utility paths. When we finished, he removed his hat, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and studied the digital map displayed on his tablet. He looked at me for several seconds before speaking. "Caleb," he said carefully, "if these readings are accurate, there is an underground connection leaving your private system and crossing into that subdivision without any recorded easement." Those words carried more weight than months of speculation. Howard documented every measurement, stamped the survey, and handed me certified copies before driving away. I stood alone beside the old fence listening to distant sprinklers hissing somewhere beyond the trees. The sound no longer irritated me. It answered every question my pressure logs had been asking for nearly a year. I finally knew where the missing water had gone. What I still did not know was who had approved the connection, who had paid to install it, and whether Diane Fairchild had simply benefited from it or had helped make it happen in the first place. I knew I finally had enough evidence to stop guessing and start thinking several moves ahead. Calling Diane immediately would accomplish nothing except giving her time to erase whatever trail still existed. People who believe they own the narrative rarely expect someone else to collect the facts first. So I stayed quiet. Every morning I continued feeding cattle, checking fences, and recording pump activity exactly as I had for months. Outwardly, nothing changed. Inwardly, every piece of evidence went into a fireproof document case sitting beside my father's old filing cabinet. Howard's certified survey rested beside county utility maps, electric bills, pressure logs, well permits, photographs, and handwritten notes documenting every unusual event since Silver Pines had opened. Looking at that growing stack of paperwork reminded me of something my father used to say whenever neighbors argued over fences. Land remembers everything. You simply have to know where to look. My next stop was the County Environmental Services office. I did not accuse anyone of theft or misconduct. Instead, I asked a simple question. If a private agricultural well were connected to another property without the owner's permission, what would be the proper legal procedure? The inspector, a soft-spoken man named Daniel Mercer, answered without hesitation. The property owner should immediately secure the private system, document the condition before making permanent changes, and notify the appropriate agencies if unauthorized infrastructure is discovered. His answer surprised me because it was so straightforward. He even pointed toward the printed regulations hanging beside his desk. Private water systems remained the responsibility of the owner, and owners had every right to isolate their own equipment when unauthorized connections threatened safety or operation. I thanked him, took a copy of the regulations, and left without mentioning Silver Pines by name. Driving back across the county line, I finally understood exactly what my next step had to be. It was not revenge. It was maintenance. A few days later, I installed 2 additional security cameras overlooking the eastern fence line and the old valve assembly near the abandoned easement. The cameras recorded continuously, day and night, capturing every vehicle, every visitor, and every movement along that forgotten strip of land. I also replaced the worn brass lock protecting the main service valve with a weather-resistant commercial model and photographed the installation from every angle. If anyone touched that equipment after today, there would be no confusion about who had done it. Diane noticed the cameras almost immediately. She stopped beside the fence one afternoon while I repaired a gate hinge and smiled that familiar practice smile. "Upgrading security?" she asked. I nodded without looking up from my wrench. "Just protecting my property." Her expression barely changed, but she lingered several seconds longer than usual before driving away. That evening, my pump cycled 3 separate times after sunset, even though the ranch used almost no water. I stood beside the storage tank listening to the motor echo across the pasture while distant sprinklers whispered somewhere beyond the trees. The pattern had not stopped because whoever depended on that hidden connection still believed it belonged to them. I glanced toward the old valve beneath the fading evening light and realized it had quietly become the most important piece of equipment on the entire ranch. Soon, I would turn it exactly as the law allowed, and whatever happened afterward would no longer be my decision. It would simply be the truth catching up with everyone who had ignored it. The morning I chose to isolate my own water system felt almost ordinary. The sky over the pasture glowed pale orange, cattle wandered toward the troughs, and a cool breeze carried the smell of damp grass through the open barn doors. I filled every livestock tank before sunrise, topped off the storage reservoir, and completed every task that depended on the well. Nothing on my ranch would go without water that day. Only after everything under my responsibility had been taken care of did I walk toward the old valve sitting beside the abandoned utility corridor. Before touching it, I photographed the entire assembly from every angle. I recorded the pressure gauge, the flow meter, the new security lock, and the surrounding fence line. Then I opened my notebook and wrote the exact time. 7:23 in the morning. My cameras captured every movement as I slowly turned the steel wheel until the valve reached its fully closed position. The familiar vibration echoed through the pipe before fading into complete silence. That silence lasted less than 20 minutes. My phone rang first. The caller identification displayed Diane Fairchild. I let it ring until voicemail answered. Then another call came from an unfamiliar number. Then another. By 8 o'clock, my voicemail box contained messages demanding that I restore water immediately because neighborhood sprinklers had stopped working, decorative fountains had gone dry, and several homeowners claimed their irrigation controllers reported pressure failures. Listening to those messages almost made me laugh because every caller unknowingly admitted the same thing. They all believed they had been using water that never belonged to them. I continued repairing a section of fence as though nothing unusual had happened. Around 9 o'clock, a white Lexus raced down my gravel driveway, throwing dust high into the morning air. Diane climbed out before the vehicle completely stopped. Her polished smile had disappeared for the first time since I had met her. She marched directly toward the valve, stopping only when she noticed the new lock and the security cameras pointed in her direction. "Open it," she demanded. "You cannot cut off an entire neighborhood." I calmly wiped my hands with an old shop towel before answering. "I did not disconnect your neighborhood. I secured my private water system." She insisted the subdivision depended on that supply because it had been operating for months. I asked one simple question. "Can you show me the easement that gives your neighborhood the right to my well?" She opened her mouth, then closed it without saying a word. Instead, she reached for her phone. I watched her pace back and forth while speaking loudly enough for me to hear pieces of the conversation. She described me as an uncooperative ranch owner creating a public emergency. She claimed I had intentionally interrupted essential community infrastructure. She never once mentioned whose infrastructure it actually was. Less than 30 minutes later, the distant sound of sirens drifted across the pasture. 2 county patrol vehicles turned onto my driveway, followed by another SUV I recognized from the county inspector's office. Exactly as I had hoped, every camera continued recording while I stood quietly beside the valve with my documentation already organized inside a weatherproof binder. Diane looked relieved when the deputies arrived. She smiled with complete confidence, convinced the law had finally come to force me into reopening something she had never possessed the legal right to use. She still believed this was an argument about shutting off water. She had no idea it was about proving where that water had been going all along. Deputy Collins accepted the weatherproof binder without saying a word. He flipped through the certified survey first, then the county utility maps, followed by months of pressure logs, electric bills, well permits, and photographs documenting every stage of my investigation. Daniel Mercer from the County Environmental Services Office quietly joined him, comparing Howard Ellis's stamped survey with the official infrastructure records he had brought from the county. The only sounds were pages turning, distant cattle calling from the pasture, and the soft breeze moving through the oak trees above us. Diane stood beside her Lexus with her arms crossed, confident that someone would eventually force me to reopen the valve. That confidence lasted less than 5 minutes. Mr. Mercer looked toward the eastern fence line before asking a question that immediately changed the atmosphere. "Mrs. Fairchild, can you provide documentation authorizing a connection to Mr. Whitaker's private agricultural well?" Diane answered with the same polished confidence she always carried. She claimed the subdivision had been using that supply since construction, insisted the developer had handled everything properly, and suggested the paperwork could be located later. Mr. Mercer calmly replied that legal authority does not arrive later. It arrives before installation. Deputy Collins nodded slowly while reviewing the security photographs showing the locked valve, the property markers, and the abandoned easement. Then I handed him one final document. It was the original 1968 well permit issued to my grandfather, clearly identifying the entire system as a private agricultural water source serving Whitaker Ranch alone. No secondary connections, no subdivision access, no shared infrastructure, just one ranch. Mr. Mercer requested permission to inspect the suspected connection immediately. I unlocked the gate, and together we walked toward the old utility corridor. Less than 30 minutes later, the inspection crew uncovered exactly what the surveys had predicted. Beneath a layer of fresh soil rested a modern pipeline connected to my original supply before disappearing beneath the subdivision entrance landscaping. Every camera on my property recorded the discovery. Nobody argued anymore. There was nothing left to argue about. Over the following weeks, the county required the unauthorized connection to be removed and documented the entire process. The subdivision's developer and the Homeowners Association became responsible for addressing the infrastructure issue through proper legal channels instead of relying on someone else's private well. Diane no longer visited my fence line with unsolicited advice, and the certified letters stopped arriving almost overnight. My pump returned to its normal operating schedule for the first time in nearly a year. The electric bills dropped back to where they had always been. The cattle troughs filled with steady pressure again, and the old storage tank finally stayed full through the hottest afternoons of summer. Sometimes I still walk past that weathered steel valve before sunrise with a cup of black coffee in my hand. It looks exactly the same as it did before any of this began. Rust on the handle, faded paint on the pipe, quiet as ever. The difference is that now I understand what my father meant all those years ago. Property does not defend itself with anger. It defends itself with records, patience, and the simple decision to stand firm when the facts are on your side. Justice never arrived with flashing lights or raised voices. It arrived one document at a time, one measurement at a time, until the truth became impossible for anyone to ignore. And every time I hear clean well water flowing into the cattle troughs beneath the Texas sunrise, I remember that the strongest victory is often the quiet one that belongs to the person who never stopped respecting the truth.